Kia ora koutou. You're here with us today on another webinar to help you learn about Vernon CMS and get the most out of it. Today we're going to be covering XML Import. So XML Import is a complex process, but we're going to break it down for you and show you a few different examples of how you can use it. So we will talk about what is XML as a concept. I'll show you how you can use the XML Import spreadsheet that's available to you. I'll show an example of importing data into existing records, importing brand new records, and importing data into other types of files. We'll also talk about how to use both XML export and XML import in combination to do data cleanup, and we'll finish off with some tips and tricks.
XML is an international standard. It's short for Extensible Markup Language. And it's a way of taking data and structuring it so that different computer systems can understand it, while at the same time generally trying to keep it human readable as well. So I've got on my screen the XML data format. It's come from our XML spreadsheet. So you can see that we have a hierarchical structure here of what in XML are called tags. So they're kind of labels that say that a piece of information is starting from here, and then further on we would see another tag that ends that particular section. So here we have a tag saying we've got a record set, so a group of records that are going to start here, and further down the page at the end of the file there'll be another tag that closes off that whole section. And then within that we've got individual records. We've given them, in this case, an attribute. We've said that each of them has an ID number. And then within that, we have further elements, which in our case represent fields of object cataloging information. So you can see that it's basically human readable, but it is a type of computer code, a structured language where there is strict rules around the syntax of that. And Vernon CMS helps you with managing that data. So both in generating XML data out of the system through the reporting tool and through generating XML data which we can understand and bring into the system via our standard Excel spreadsheet format.
So the first thing I'll show you is how to find the XML Import Excel spreadsheet that's available to you. Wherever your WinCol folder is at your organization, for me, I've got it on the C drive, you go to the WinCol folder and then go into the toolkit folder. And in there, you'll find the XML import spreadsheet. So it's xmlimport.xlsm. Now, what you don't want to do is open that and edit it. You want to select it, make a copy of it. So either Control-C or right-click and go copy. And then you want to paste that in a location that makes sense to you, somewhere that's easy to access. It might be a shared folder that's shared with other staff so they can access the file as well. But it's really important that you make a copy of it and then paste it somewhere else. So I've already prepared an XML import file, and it's about acquisition information, and it's for existing records that we have. So this is what the XML import file looks like. So what we have here is two tabs. We have control and data. Now, one of the things that you need to do when you first come into here is make sure that the macros are enabled. So I'm going to go to options and I'm going to enable the macros. So on the data tab, that's where you load all of your data and you specify which fields it's going to go into. So here we have the System ID field, and I've just called that ID. We have acquisition method. And it's important to note that all the field names here, all these headers, are in lowercase and they don't use spaces. So either you could not use spaces at all or use an underscore to represent a space, but important that it's lowercase and no spaces. So here we have the different information about how the object was acquired, the date that it was acquired, who provided it, and what their role was. And this represents each of the individual objects that we're going to update. Each row represents one record. So all that information there is relating to one record. So now I'm going to go back to the Control tab. We have these instructions here, if you need a reminder when you're using it. What I'm going to do here is go to the destination field. So this is where to save this file. So when I click generate, it's going to create an XML file. So that data that you saw before that Paul was showing you, it's going to create it within the C temp folder. So I'm going to go ahead and click generate, and it says file export successful. That's great. That's exactly what I want to see. So I'm going to click OK there. So that was the first part of the XML import process. There's 3 stages. There's preparing your data, which is what I've done just now. There's the XML import configuration. So that's where we configure what we're importing within Vernon CMS. And lastly, the import. So now I'm going to move to the second stage, and I'm going to go into Vernon. Before I get started, there's something I want to show you because it becomes important in a moment. I'm going to go into the object acquisition window and show you the acquisition source and role fields here. Now you'll note that they're within a table format. So this is a single field, but this information here, acquisition source and role, is within a table. You need to know if you're importing data into a table because there's something a little bit special that you have to do in the configuration. So I'll close that now. So when you're doing your XML import configuration, go to Tools, XML, XML Import, Configuration. Within this configuration window, we've got 3 tabs. So I'm going to start off with parameters, and I'm going to give this configuration a name. I'm going to call it Acquisition Data 2022. Next, I need to specify which file this is going into. So it's the object file. So I'll type object in there, and I'll select that from the list. Now here's where we choose the XML file that we generated. There's the file that I created just now. I'll select that, click open, and now you can see that that's listed. So that's telling Vernon this is where we want you to pull the information from. I do also need to select a status for records. So even if you don't have new records in your file, it's important to select a status there. So I'm just going to choose accessioned. So those are the 4 main fields that you need to fill out there. If I now go to the field mapping tab, we have a very handy button here, which is called Get Element Headings from XML File. And if you click that, it's going to pull through those headers that we specified in the Excel spreadsheet, and it'll say that they're imported data. What we need to do now is specify which Vernon CMS field these should go into. I know that the field name for the system ID is just ID, so I'll just type that in. But these other ones, I won't type them because I know that they're near the top of the list and they're quite easy to retrieve. So I could go in and choose each of these. Acquisition date, click the options button, choose acquisition date, acquisition source, and then lastly, you can see this one is acquisition source role. Now, for each of these, we need to determine whether we're going to replace or append the data. So for the method, we're going to append. For the date, we're going to replace. And that's because the date field is a single value field. There aren't separate rows in there, so you can only replace there. For these other 2, I'm going to choose append. If you wanted to see what the options were in there, you can click the options button. Now, remember how I showed you that the acquisition source and the role were in a table? What we need to do here in the table group column is give each of them a number. This number could be any number. It just has to be the same number. So what that tells Vernon is that this data needs to be aligned within the table, that this data is part of a group. So I could put the number 2 for both of those. I could put the number 500. It really just needs to be a number that matches. I'll show you an example later where we've got more than one table of data within an import. So we've done our field mapping. Now we're going to go to the record matching tab, and we are going to choose matching with system ID. So there's 3 options here. No matching, create new records, and I'll show you that soon. Matching with import field, and if you were matching with accession number, that's where you'd do that. This is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to choose matching with system ID. And now I can save that. And I'm going to close it because I'm about to run the import. And when you run an XML import, it's a really good idea to have all your windows closed so that they're not locked when you're trying to do an import. So now I'll go back to the Tools menu, XML, XML Import, and Import. So this is the actual import window. For the Parameters tab, I'm going to choose the configuration that I just set up. So if I click on that button there, the Options button, there we have my acquisition data 2022. Click OK, and it's automatically populated this other information that I specified earlier. So that's great. All I need to do now is click the Import button, and it will start the import. So this is the import matching window. And when you have a value in your spreadsheet that has more than one possible match, Vernon will ask which of those possible matches do you want to choose. So in our spreadsheet, we had Charles Windsor, and actually we've got two possible matches, Charles Windsor, which is the one I want, and Harry Windsor, because Harry's middle name is Charles. So in this example, I'm going to choose Charles. That's the one that I want. It's a good example of a case where in your spreadsheet, you might actually want to use the ID number rather than text, because then you can be more specific about which value you're wanting to import. So I've chosen Charles Windsor. I know that I've got two examples of Charles Windsor in my spreadsheet. So I'm going to choose Import Match Term into Field, but I'm also going to select this option here for all occurrences. If I didn't tick that, it would just ask me again. So I want to save myself some time. I could have 60 examples of Charles Windsor, and so I'm going to choose Import Matched Term into Field. And now my import has finished. I have the option to open that list of records. And now if we go to Object, Acquisition, Provenance and Rights, I'll be able to see that that new data has come through, where we have Bill Vernon as an acquisition source and Charles Windsor. Okay, so I'll close those and we'll move on to our next example, which is importing completely new records. So starting off with stage one, which is preparing my data, I will remember to enable my macros. And the collection that we have here is a wonderful collection of snow globes. And we have quite a bit more data in this spreadsheet. So we've got an accession number, classification, who classified it, who we got it from, what was their role, and credit lines, saying it's part of the Sparkly Treasure collection, which is very dear to our heart. So what we're going to do now, all the data is specified in there. So we'll go back to the Control tab. In the destination field, I have said where I want this to be generated. Click Generate XML. And actually, we already have that in there. So I will overwrite that file. So now we go into Vernon to do the second stage, which is configuring the XML import. So we go to Tools, XML, XML Import, Configuration. Now again, this is one I've prepared earlier, so I'm not going to set this up now. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I can click into that field, choose Advanced Search, and here we have our snow globe object file configuration. And once I've chosen that, it's brought up all the data that I entered earlier. So let's have a look at the Field Mapping tab. So we have quite a bit of information in here, and what you'll notice is that we have a combination of imported data and static text. So static text is when you enter information directly into this configuration screen. It hasn't come from the spreadsheet. I've entered this manually into this screen. And this is information that should apply across all of the records that we're importing. So consistently, it's going to apply the same department across all of these new records. And this number 5 represents the ID for that department. This number 10 represents the ID for the object type, so you can be very specific about that. Here in the table group column, you can see we've got some groups of data that are in tables. So this classification information, is all in a table. This production information is in a table. Same with the acquisition source. So again, these numbers could be anything. They just have to be the same number. But of course, it may make sense to you as you're going through, say, this is the first table, this is the second table, and so on. Something else I'll draw your attention to is the text combine group. So this is saying that these two credit line pieces of information that we're pulling from the spreadsheet, we want to combine that into one text field, and we want to separate them with a full stop and a space. So that's basically bringing together that information that we had about kindly donated by, full stop, space, part of the Sparkly Treasure collection. So that's an example of how you can do that if you need to, combining the text into one long sentence with a full stop in the middle. So now I'll move on to the record matching tab, and we are choosing no matching because we're creating brand new records. So I will save and close that. And now I'll run the import. And I'll choose the snow globes configuration file there, and I'll click import. I'm importing the accession number, so it's going to ask if I want to validate that. If I have an invalid accession number, Vernon will tell me, but I can also choose to not validate it. And if I find that it's incorrect, I can change that later. That's part of what the XML matching window will do, is check that type of data for you. So importing those records, you can see the status bar there. If you ever need to stop an import while it's running, you can click the stop button there. And so here it's saying that the value of import is being mapped to the primary production role, and it wants me to choose the correct data. So here I'm actually going to create a new term, a new authority term. I'm actually going to create importer, save that, and it's created that for me. So that was an example of a value that didn't exist in Vernon. I've created it. Now that I've chosen it, I can choose to import it into that field for all occurrences of that value. All the records have been processed, and I can have a look at those. There they all are there. If I just open one of those, we can take a look. And here we have our snow globe representing the Taj Mahal. And the information that we had in the spreadsheet has now been entered into this record. So I'll close those and I'll show you my next example, which is about importing new authority terms. So I'll go to the control tab. I'll make sure that macros have been enabled. And I'll go to the data tab. And what I'm doing here is I'm adding to Vernon via XML import a whole lot of new roles, person roles that I want to have available in the system. So I've only got one column. It's quite a simple import. I'll go to the control tab. I've already specified where I want this to be generated to and what the file name should be. And then I will click on Generate XML. The file already exists. So I'm just going to overwrite that file, and it has been successful. So that's the first stage, preparing the data. Now we're going to do the configuration. So I'll go into Vernon, and you'll be getting familiar with this now. Tools, XML, XML Import, Configuration. So on the Parameters tab, I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call this Role Terms. I'm going to specify which data file this should go into, and I'm going to type role in here, because what I want is production role. So I'll select that there. Choose the default import file. So this is choosing that file that we just generated, roles. And now we'll move to the field mapping tab. I'll press that Get Element Headings button. It will pull through that information. And I'm going to choose the relevant field here, which I know is AU name, authority name. We're importing it. And I'll just select append in there. In the record matching tab, again, no matching, we're creating new records. So I will save that, close it, and now stage 3, I'm going to do the import. So XML, XML import, import. I'll click the options button and choose that one that I just created, role terms. And now I'm ready to import. So those 26 records were imported pretty quickly. They were pretty simple. So I can go OK. And see the list of them there. They've all been imported. And what I can do is go to Object, Identification, and then in the role field, I can click the options button and I can see that those terms have been added. So we already had some existing in there. You can see the brick maker, the broom maker, Tinker the Tailor, candlestick maker, all in there. So I can cancel out of there. And that was 3 examples of how to do XML imports.
And so you can see from those examples that XML import's very powerful. We can import data both to existing records and we can create new records in any file in the system. When we get a new customer, almost all of those new sites have existing legacy data, and we solely use the XML import tool as our way of migrating that legacy data. So we're constantly dealing with all kinds of different data formats, and we use our own tool to get the data into the system. Another example that we can use it for is to massage or edit data in some way that maybe wouldn't be easy directly within the system. And we can do that by doing an XML export out of the system. So creating an XML file, just using the generic reporting tool that's in Vernon, and then editing that data inside that file. So I've got 4 books that are in my collection, and I've decided that I want to change somehow the data that's in the description field for all of those. So I first need to generate an XML file with that content. I can go to the reporting tool, and I've already created a report format for that earlier. I'll just edit that report format so that we can see what I had set up. So in the formatting options, I've said that I want that to be in Vernon XML 2.0, so that's our latest XML format. XML is a structure where it can have a whole range of different tags to suit different data structures. And so we've got our own specific format that's compatible with the Vernon database. Like we had with the spreadsheet, we need to say, well, where is this file going to get saved to? So I'll put a destination for that. By default, it'll tick that it will include an overview about what fields are included in that file. That isn't actually necessary for this process, but we'll be able to see that data when I run the report. So I can generate that file now just through the Run Report page, clicking on Export, or in fact, I've already got that file open. So we'll just switch to where I've got that file open. And so this is the file that's come out of Vernon. So we can see that introduction section about what fields that I've included. So we call that the dictionary. And so I just had 2 fields included, the system ID and the description field. And then we can see several repeating sections representing each of those object records. So there'll be 4 of those sections for the 4 objects that I chose. And for each of them, we can see the ID number and we can see the description. I chose not to overwrite this file because I have already edited these descriptions in advance. So we can just directly edit this data in this file and change it in ways that maybe wouldn't have been easy just through a bulk tool. There might have been some hand edits and a combination of some find and replace actions to tidy up some information. And so I've saved the changes to that file, and now I can use our tools to bring that same file back into Vernon. So we'll swap to Vernon now, and I'll close those records. We should close those records, as otherwise the XML import will fail on any ones that are open. So any record that's open is currently in an editing state in the system, and 2 different processes can't edit the same record at the same time. So I'll need to close that to prevent the first of those records being blocked in the import step. So again, I'll go back to Tools, XML Import. And in my case, I've already created a configuration. I've just called that Object Brief Description Import. I could just run that at this stage, but I'll go into that configuration so that we can see what different options I had set. So I'll click on the option to go to the highlighted term, and that'll bring up the same configuration screen. So I've already set up what file that this particular configuration is looking for, and we know we've already created that. I've set up what fields are in there. We know we've just got an ID field. We're only importing that for the sake of matching to the same records so that we can update descriptions in those fields. And I've said where the data is going to be imported to. So another example of this process would be if you're wanting to duplicate the data to a different field. So an example that came up for a real museum client recently was that they had a lot of brief description information and they were wanting to publish that to their online website, but some of those descriptions included sensitive information. So what they did is an XML export of all the brief descriptions, and then they used the import step to import it not back to brief description, but to a new dedicated text field, just using one of our user-defined fields, which they called online public description. So that process essentially allowed them to bulk copy all of the descriptions for the records they exported and bulk import it back into a different field. And then the catalogers worked on updating that new online description field, taking out the sensitive information, while they were still able to retain the original brief descriptions in the field where it already was. In my case, I'm just doing a simpler process. I'm just importing it straight back into brief description. And I'm saying that I'm replacing the data that's already there. So the change I've made is that the brief description was repeating the title of each book, which was unnecessary. So I've removed that in the XML data, and we can now run that import and bulk update all 4 of those records. So I'll click on import now, and that'll be pretty quick. And we can see those new brief descriptions that match up what we had in the file that I was looking at. You may end up bulk importing data in error. There might be something in your configuration that you hadn't spotted. You're perhaps importing the data into a different field than you intended. The system always keeps a full audit trail of the changes that are made, and that's your first recourse for undoing things that you've done by mistake. If I have supervisor access, I can go to Tools, System Maintenance, Audit, and I can choose to do a recovery of undoing information that I've changed. So if I did a recovery undo, it says which files are there changes where you're wanting to undo, and it's in the object file in my case. And then we can be specific about what kinds of changes we're undoing. So we might only want to undo changes that I've made and from a certain date and time. So maybe only from today and only from midday. I'm just going to do a report only, and we'll just see an example of what changes were detected and what would be undone if I went ahead with this process. So that's found 4 records, and it's saying details about what records it's found. And so those are the 4 that we've just updated, and they would be undone back to the state that they had immediately before midday today. XML is something that's not just specific to Vernon. There's all different XML formats for different data standards. So if I open up an example, this is Dublin Core, which is an international standard for exchanging descriptions about things in the world. And it's used widely within the cultural heritage sector as a way of taking basic collection record information and moving it between systems. So as an example, both Trove in Australia, the national aggregator for cultural heritage records, and Digital NZ, the equivalent in New Zealand, accept Dublin Core as a format of information that they understand, and they can then bring information that might have been from a whole range of different software systems. And so Dublin Core is just using that same style of opening and closing tags, but they just have their own names for the fields that exist in that standard. So Dublin Core Title, Dublin Core Creator, etc. We saw before in Penny's example that she had 2 people with the same names, or similar names. And so we'll see that happen a lot, that you'll have authority terms where there's possible duplicates or similar entries which we found during the importing step. We can fine-tune that by recording the ID in the import data. So in this example, we've got Andrew Dyson as an acquisition source. If I look in Vernon and did a search on the person file, so I'll search for Andrew Dyson. There's actually two possible matches for that. One person has an additional middle name. And so whenever you're wanting to speed up the XML import, you have the option of, instead of just saying the name, which will just do a text-based search on it, we can use the ID. And it's the show IDs checkbox on the options for that field that let you see the IDs that are available. So I may be wanting to match specifically to Andrew Dyson, the record number 179. And so that's the number that I could put in my XML spreadsheet to speed up that import process. So if I had 179 there, that's just going to match straight up to that record rather than prompting me on every single one of those. We saw also that the headings here are in lowercase and without spaces. That's not a Vernon CMS convention. That's part of the XML standard. So XML is case sensitive. So you could put your headings in upper and lowercase, but you'd have to get exactly the same case in Vernon. And so that's why we recommend just putting them in lowercase, because it avoids any of those issues with accidentally having an uppercase letter at the start and then forgetting that when you're setting up the matching. We can also have cases where an XML import is interrupted partway through. So I'll run the same snow globes import that Penny ran, and I'll deliberately stop that partway through, and we can see how we can pick it up again at a later point. So I've got this already set up, so I can go straight to import, and I can pick up the configuration that I have for the snow globes. And I can run that import now. If I stop that partway through, perhaps I've noticed a repeating mistake that's in there, or I've successfully imported up to a certain point, but I'm having to match on every second record the object type, I might decide to tidy up that information so that I could continue from that point at a later date. So I can stop that import, and it'll tell me details about how I can resume that. So it's saved information about where it got up to. It's given that particular import its own unique identifying number. So this is import number 28 that I've done on the system, that it's logged on this. And I can use that information to pick up the import again at a later point. So I can come back into this XML import window at a later stage. I can pick the same configuration, but in this case, I want to use the resume an incomplete import checkbox. And so that's where it'll show me all of the imports that it currently has logged in the system. And we can see that most recent one, number 28, plus some earlier test runs that I did before the presentation. So if I pick that one and now click on import, and it's picking up that I've made changes to that configuration, I can say I want to make use of those changes as well. And so that jumps immediately to where we left off. So I'm already at the point where 4 of the records are completed, and I can now carry on and say, well, we'll deal with the matching acquisition source, import that to all records. I'll skip the import of that role field. We've already shown that example. And now all of those 8 are in, 4 in the first section, and then another 4 after that point. I'll show an example now of other ways that you might make use of that static data option. A valuation import might have several different columns of information that are the same for every record. So if I was creating a configuration of valuations, so we're importing the valuations into the object file. We're going to import just the ID to match the data. We're going to import the valuation column from our spreadsheet. Then all the other pieces of value information might be the same for all of the records. You might have had a valuer come in and they've given a value of 100 different objects, a variety of different values, but it was all done on the same date by the same person using the same valuation method and for the same reason. And so in that case, instead of repeating that information in the spreadsheet, I would simply say that static text, and then I would put in quotes what the text is going to be for each of those. So I would say, perhaps it was me that was the valuer. So that's going to go into valuation person. And then it would be the same for each of the columns that's the same. So we could say that on the 6th of July 2022 was the valuation date, and so on. So that's a typical example where you'd want to use static text. All of the records we're importing have identical information, and in this case, there's just one piece of data that's changing, just the valuation information. The last note that I'll make here is the matching that we're doing. So we're matching on ID here, but you can match on other fields. So you might have a spreadsheet where all you have is the accession number or the other ID. So Vernon does support matching by fields other than ID. ID is clearly the simplest way to do it because there's always going to be a single unique match for each of those IDs. That is the permanent unique identifier for each record in Vernon, but you can do it by accession number. It just means you've got a chance of having the occasional record where there is no equivalent match in Vernon, or where there's possible multiple matches if you had duplicate accession numbers or perhaps some variation of the punctuation in those accession numbers. So I'll just show one last note about that import I did of the brief description information. So we'll go back to the configuration for that. And one of the things we haven't looked at is the advanced options. So when we generate XML data from Excel, the tag that starts the whole thing is called record set, and the tag that finishes and closes each record is just called record. That doesn't match exactly what we export out of Vernon, and that's because the exporting from Vernon supports a much more complex range of data. For example, it supports having different types of records within a single file. And so if you're going to import a file that's been exported from Vernon to begin with, you need to go into the advanced options and you need to change the root element, so the very first starting tag, to be called Vernon. That's how we label it coming out of the system. And you need to change the record tag to whatever the file was that you were exporting records for. So that might be person if you'd exported person records, but in my example, it was object. We've only been importing Vernon-related data, so data from our spreadsheet or exported from the system, but the system can import data from other XML formats. The next most common case is MARC format, which is used within the library sector. So Vernon does support importing MARC data where you might be downloading, for instance, a catalogue record from the National Library's website. You could download that as MARC format, and then you can say in the matching screen how that matches to your existing records, or if it's new records, and how you're going to map each of the fields. So which of the fields you actually want to import into Vernon from that MARC data.